There is a moment most people know well. You are lying in bed, the room is quiet, the day is over, and your mind goes back not to something that happened today, to something that happened 3 years ago. A conversation where you said the wrong thing, a moment where you froze when you should have spoken, a decision you made that you still cannot fully explain. And the strangest part is not that you remember it. The strangest part is how real it feels, not like a memory, like a wound that never quite closed. You tell yourself you should be over it, you know logically that the other people involved have probably forgotten. You know that dwelling on it changes nothing, and yet the mind keeps returning, keeps replaying, keeps asking the same question in slightly different forms. What if I had done it differently? What does it say about me that I did that? Why can I not simply let it go? This is not a failure of willpower. It is not a sign that something is wrong with it. It is the mind doing something it was built to do, something that once had a purpose, something that still runs automatically even when it is no longer useful. The mechanism behind this pattern touches almost every part of life. It shapes how you remember your relationships. It shapes how you judge your own past. It shapes what you believe about yourself based on moments that may not represent you at all. And it operates mostly below the level of conscious awareness, which is exactly what makes it so difficult to interrupt. By the end of this, you will not have a perfect solution, but you will have something more useful than that. You will have a clearer picture of what is actually happening inside the mind when it refuses to release the past, and a few honest tools for creating a little more distance between what happened and what it means. The place to begin is with a simple but uncomfortable observation. The mind does not store memories the way a camera records footage. It does not keep a complete, accurate, chronological record of events. What it stores is something far more selective, far more emotional, and far more shaped by interpretation than most people realize. When something happens to you, your mind does not file away every detail with equal weight. It pays close attention to peaks, to the most intense emotional moments, and to endings. It pays far less attention to the middle, to the duration, to the quiet stretches where nothing dramatic occurred. This is sometimes called the peak-end rule, and it has a profound effect on how you remember your own life. Think about a difficult conversation you had with someone you care about. Maybe it lasted an hour. Maybe most of that hour was calm, even productive, but there was one moment, 5 minutes long, where something sharp was said, where the tone shifted, where something felt like a rejection or a dismissal or a betrayal. When you look back on that conversation now, what do you remember the full hour or that 5-minute peak? For most people, the answer is the peak. The mind edits the rest out, not because it is dishonest, but because it is efficient. It learns to compress experience into emotional highlights, and those highlights become the story you carry forward. This is the experiencing self and the remembering self operating in very different ways. The experiencing self lives in real time. It notices the full texture of an event as it unfolds. The remembering self comes afterward, assembles a story from the most emotionally charged moments. And that story is what you call your memory. The problem is that the remembering self is not a reliable narrator. It edits, it emphasizes, it sometimes adds meaning that was not there in the original moment. And then it presents that edited version back to you with complete confidence, as though it were a faithful recording of what actually happened. This is where the replaying begins. Because what you are replaying is not the event. You are replaying the story your remembering self constructed about the event. And that story, because it was built around the most painful or most intense moment, tends to be darker, more absolute, and more defining than the original experience actually was. Here is what makes this particularly difficult. The story does not feel like a story. It feels like the truth. When you replay that embarrassing moment from 3 years ago, your body responds as though it is happening now. Your heart rate changes slightly, your stomach tightens. The emotion is real, even though the event is long over. And because the emotion is real, the mind treats the memory as real, as current, as something that still requires a response. This is a feature of fast automatic thinking, the kind of thinking that does not pause to verify whether the threat is real before it activates a response. It recognizes a pattern, it retrieves the associated emotion, and it reacts. By the time slower, more deliberate thinking has a chance to intervene, the emotional response is already running. And so you find yourself at 2 in the morning, genuinely distressed about something that happened years ago to a version of yourself who no longer exists in a situation that has long since resolved itself. The mind has not made a mistake, exactly. It has simply applied a very old and very automatic process to a situation where that process is not helping. What makes this even more layered is the role of identity. The mind does not just replay embarrassing moments because it is trying to process emotion. It replays them because it is trying to protect the story about who you are. Every time you made a mistake, every time you were rejected, every time you said something you regret, the mind files that moment as potential evidence about your character. And then it revisits that evidence not to torture you, but to try to make sense of it, to decide whether it fits the story you have about yourself or whether it threatens it. If the moment fits the story, the mind tends to release it fairly quickly. You made a mistake. You understood why. It makes sense within your self-image, and you move on. But if the moment feels like a contradiction, if it suggests something about you that you cannot easily integrate, the mind holds it. It keeps returning to it, trying different interpretations, looking for the version that resolves the tension. This is why some memories haunt you more than others. It is rarely the biggest mistakes that replay most often. It is the ones that feel most confusing, most out of character, most unresolved in terms of what they mean about you as a person. And this is where the pattern becomes genuinely costly, because the mind, in its attempt to resolve the confusion, often reaches for the harshest available interpretation. Not because it wants to punish you, but because a clear answer, even a painful one, feels better than ongoing uncertainty. The mind will often choose a definitive negative conclusion over the discomfort of not knowing. It would rather believe something unflattering and certain than something ambiguous and open. This shows up in relationships in a very specific way. Someone you care about says something careless. A friend does not respond to your message for 2 days. A partner gives you a look that feels cold, and your mind, running its fast automatic process, does not present you with a range of possible explanations. It presents you with the most emotionally available one, the one that connects most easily to an older fear, an older pattern, an older story. So instead of thinking, they are probably busy, you think they are pulling away. Instead of thinking, that comment was thoughtless, you think they do not respect me. Instead of thinking, I'm not sure what that look meant, you think, something is wrong and I'm the reason. The mind has not lied to you, it has simply moved faster than the evidence allows. It has filled in the gaps with the story that was most accessible, most familiar, most connected to your emotional history. And then it has presented that story with the confidence of a conclusion. This is where the pattern begins to affect not just how you feel in a moment, but how you behave across time. Because once the mind has decided what something means, it starts looking for confirmation. This is confirmation bias operating in its most personal form. You have formed a quick interpretation, and now your attention naturally gravitates toward anything that supports it. The things that contradict it become harder to notice, easier to dismiss. So if the mind has decided that a friend is pulling away, you start noticing every small absence and discounting every moment of warmth. If the mind has decided that you made a terrible impression on someone, you start reading every neutral interaction as evidence of their judgment. If the mind has decided that you are someone who makes the same mistakes over and over, you start seeing your history as a pattern of failure rather than a series of separate events with separate causes. The memory does not just replay the past. It quietly shapes how you interpret the present. Here is where this becomes more personal and more important to sit with. Most people assume that the problem is the memory itself. If they could just forget that moment, if they could just stop replaying it, they would be fine. But the replaying is a symptom, not the cause. The cause is the unresolved question underneath it, the question the mind is still trying to answer. And that question is almost always some version of, what does this mean about who I am? That question is not irrational. It is deeply human. The need to understand yourself, to have a coherent story about your own character, your own worth, your own place in the world, is one of the most fundamental needs the mind has. The problem is that the mind often tries to answer that question using the wrong material. It uses the most emotionally intense moments, the most painful memories, the most charged interactions, and it builds a self-image from those highlights, the same way it builds a memory from peaks and endings. Which means the story you carry about yourself is probably not a fair or complete representation. It is a story assembled from the moments that felt most significant emotionally, which tends to mean the moments where something went wrong, where you fell short, where you were hurt or embarrassed or rejected. The quiet, ordinary moments where you were kind, competent, patient, and good are much harder for the mind to hold on to. They do not carry the same emotional weight. They do not get filed in the same way. This is the negativity bias operating at the level of self-perception. The mind is built to pay more attention to threats than to safety, to losses than to gains, to painful moments than to pleasant ones. This was useful when the threats were physical and immediate. It is far less useful when the threat is a memory of a conversation from years ago. But the same mechanism runs in both cases. And so the self-image that most people carry is subtly, persistently skewed toward the negative, not because they are pessimistic by nature, but because the mind has been doing its job, which is to notice and remember what went wrong in a context where that job produces a distorted picture. The secondary cost of this is something worth naming clearly. When you carry a self-image built from painful peaks, you start making decisions from that image. You avoid things because you have decided you're the kind of person who fails at them. You stay in situations that are not right for you because you have decided you do not deserve better, or because the familiar discomfort feels safer than the unfamiliar possibility of something different. You hold back in relationships because you have decided that the real you, the one revealed in those worst moments, is not someone worth knowing fully. The remembered self begins to constrain the living self. The story about who you were becomes a set of limits on who you allow yourself to be. There is also a particularly subtle version of this that deserves attention. The mind does not only replay painful memories, it also revises them over time. With each replay, small details shift. The tone of what someone said becomes a little sharper. Your own response seems a little worse than it was. The context that would explain your behavior fades, and what remains is a cleaner, harsher version of the event. A version that confirms whatever conclusion the mind has already reached. This is not deliberate distortion, it is simply how memory works. Each time you recall something, you're not retrieving a stored file. You're reconstructing the event from fragments, and the reconstruction is shaped by your current emotional state, your current beliefs, and the story you have been telling yourself since the event happened. The memory changes a little each time you access it, and you never notice, because the new version feels exactly as real and exact as the previous one. This means that some of the things you are most certain about from your past may be the things that have been revised the most. The memories that carry the strongest emotional charge are the ones you have revisited most often, and therefore the ones that have been reconstructed and subtly altered the most times. This is not a reason to distrust all of your memories. It is a reason to hold the most charged ones with a slightly looser grip. To recognize that the version of the past you carry is a version shaped by emotion, by repetition, and by the story your mind was trying to tell, not a lie, but not a perfect record either. So what can you actually do with this? Not to become someone who never replays anything, because that is not realistic, and a complete absence of self-reflection would create its own problems. But to interrupt the pattern before it runs all the way to a verdict, the first and most important thing is to notice the difference between an event and the story about the event. When a memory surfaces, or when you feel yourself beginning to replay something, pause for a moment and try to separate what actually happened from what you have concluded about it. What were the specific facts? What was said, what was done, what was the context, and then separately, what meaning has the mind attached to those facts? This distinction is harder than it sounds, because the story feels like part of the event. The interpretation feels like the reality, but they are not the same thing. The event is what happened. The story is what the mind did with it afterward, and the story is where the distortion lives. The second tool is to question the completeness of the memory. When you find yourself replaying a moment that feels defining, ask honestly, is this the whole picture? What was happening in my life at that time that might explain my behavior? What was happening in the other person's life that might explain theirs? What parts of the situation has the mind edited out because they did not fit the emotional peak? This is not about making excuses. It is about giving the memory the same fairness you would give a stranger's story. If a friend told you about a difficult moment from their past, you would naturally ask about the context. You would not immediately accept the harshest interpretation. But when the memory is your own, the mind tends to skip the context and go straight to the verdict. The third tool is to ask what you would say to someone you care about if they describe the same moment to you. If a close friend came to you and said, I did this thing 3 years ago and I cannot stop thinking about it, what would your response be? Would you confirm their harsher self-judgment? Or would you offer a more complete, more compassionate reading of the situation? Most people find that they are far harder on themselves than they would ever be on someone they love. The standard they apply to their own past is harsher, less contextual, and less forgiving than the standard they would apply to anyone else. Noticing this gap is not about forcing yourself to feel better. It is about recognizing that the harsh standard is not more accurate. It is just more automatic. The fourth tool is to be careful about when you revisit difficult memories. The mind is more likely to reach for negative interpretations when you are tired, when you are already feeling low, when you are lonely, or when something in the present has activated an old emotional pattern. Revisiting a charged memory in those states is a bit like reading a difficult message when you are already upset. The interpretation will be shaped by the emotional context, not just by the content. This does not mean avoiding all self-reflection when you're struggling, but it does mean being aware that the conclusions you reach about yourself in your lowest moments are not your most reliable conclusions. They are the mind working quickly, reaching for the most available story in a state where accuracy is not the priority. The fifth tool is perhaps the most counterintuitive. Instead of trying to stop the replaying, try to change what you're looking for when the memory returns. Most people replay a difficult moment searching for resolution, for the answer to what it means about them. But that search tends to loop because the mind does not find a satisfying answer, and so it keeps returning to the question. What if, instead of asking, what does this say about me? You asked, what was I dealing with at the time? What was I trying to do? Even if I did it imperfectly, what did I learn that I would not have learned any other way? These questions do not erase the memory, but they redirect the search towards something more useful than a verdict on your character. The mind will still replay. That is what minds do. But the replay does not have to end in the same place every time. There is one more thing worth saying, and it connects back to where this began. The reason the mind replays difficult moments is not simply because it is broken or because it enjoys causing pain. It replays them because it cares about something. It cares about understanding. It cares about not making the same mistake again. It cares about knowing who you are and whether you are someone worth trusting and respecting. These are not small things. They are the things that make a person thoughtful, self-aware, and capable of growth. The problem is not the caring, the problem is the method. A mind that replays the worst moments and builds a self-image from those peaks is using a tool that was designed for a different kind of threat. It is applying a survival mechanism to a question about identity, and the fit is not good. The goal is not to stop caring about your past or your character. The goal is to give that caring a better instrument. One that includes more of the picture, one that holds the painful moments without letting them become the whole story. One that can sit with the question of what this means without rushing to the harshest available answer. You're not the worst version of yourself that your memory has preserved. You are not the sum of your most charged and painful moments. The remembering self-edits, it emphasizes, it constructs. And what it constructs is real and meaningful, but it is not complete. The past is not a fixed record. It is a story that can be held more carefully, more honestly, and with a little more room for the parts that did not make it into the emotional highlights. That does not mean pretending that difficult moments did not happen. It means recognizing that they happened alongside a great deal else that the mind did not find worth filing. The ordinary moments of patience, decency, effort, and care that did not carry enough emotional weight to be preserved as peaks, but that were just as real. Better thinking in this sense is not about silencing the mind or eliminating the replay. It is about learning to be a slightly fairer witness to your own history, to pause before the story becomes a verdict, to notice when the remembering self is doing its job and when it is quietly doing too much. That small pause, that moment of recognition before the conclusion settles in, is not a dramatic transformation. It is a practice. And like most practices, it becomes more natural with repetition. Not perfect, not instant, but gradually a little more spacious, a little more honest, a little more free. If this gave you a clearer way to see what your mind does with the past, subscribe for more videos on psychology, judgment, and the hidden patterns behind everyday human behavior.